Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piattoly, and today I'm going to be your host. Do you currently take fish oil, eat salmon, or use a product with omega-3? Did you even realize you can test your blood for omega-3 levels? And your levels could indicate an increased or decreased risk for specific medical conditions. In this podcast, we're going to speak with Kelly Patterson, clinical nutrition educator at OmegaQuant Analytics, about the value of knowing your omega-3 score, the risk of being deficient, how to optimize it with either food or supplementation, and why levels between 8 and 12% are important to improve your quality of life and reduce your risk for disease. Kelly is a registered dietitian and certified specialist in sports dietetics based in Raleigh, North Carolina, specializing in biomarkers for human performance and longevity. After spending most of her career working for the U.S. military, including 5 years as a tactical performance dietitian for Army Special Operations, she is currently the clinical nutrition educator for OmegaQuant Analytics. Kelly completed her bachelor's degree in dietetic internship at SUNY Buffalo State College in Buffalo, New York, and her master's degree in human performance and sports nutrition at Logan University in Chesterfield, Missouri. Kelly, thank you so much for joining today's podcast with us. I'm excited to chat with you about this topic.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's dive in and kind of talk about some things all related to omega-3. First of all, tell us about OmegaQuant and their testing program, with really being the first company to develop this test. Tell us about who OmegaQuant is and what they do.
Sure, yeah. So we are a clinical lab. That's our primary function. Is we are a lab and we do blood testing, dried blood spot testing, and our expertise is in omega-3 and fatty acid levels. We were founded in 2009 by Dr. Bill Harris, and he was kind of one of the founding researchers of our flagship test, which is the omega-3 index. And so he started the company to make that test available to the wider public. And we sell tests to the general public, but also healthcare practitioners. We work with businesses, sports teams, practitioners of kind of all different varieties in primarily the omega-3 testing space.
So let's talk about this actual test. What is the omega-3 index test, and how does OmegaQuant measure it?
Sure, yeah. So the omega-3 index is a unique test in that it is a red blood cell measure of omega-3 levels. So often in many labs, if you were to ask for any kind of omega-3 measurement, what you would end up getting is a whole blood or a plasma level of omega-3 levels. And so that would be levels of different omega-3 fatty acids in the plasma of our blood. And the way I like to sort of explain it to people is it's the difference between taking a fasting blood sugar and taking a hemoglobin A1C. Both may have a use, but the hemoglobin A1C, like the omega-3 index, is a red blood cell measure. And so it gives a longer term idea of omega-3 intakes and is still responsive to dietary changes. So with a plasma measurement, you get a lot more sort of noise. There's a lot more things that can affect that in the really short term. If you were to eat a very heavy omega-3 dinner, let's say the night before, that may have a small effect on your levels. You have to fast for a plasma test. It also requires a venous blood draw. So that adds kind of a level of inaccessibility for folks. With an omega-3 index, because it is red blood cell based, there's no fasting required. And it can be done on a dried blood spot. So that's how our tests are administered. It's a simple prick of the finger with a little lancet, a few drops of blood on a card, and then that is dried and sent into our lab for analysis. And so it's really easily accessible to patients. It makes it something that is easier for them to do. And it gives us that 3-ish month idea of your intakes of omega-3, similar to that of a hemoglobin A1C.
So you kind of answered my next question, because it was going to be about, is this an easy test to do at home? And it seems like this is something someone can buy on the website or somewhere, and then they can get this test and prick their finger, drop the blood, and send it back in.
Yep, it's super easy to do. Like I said, it's very user friendly. It's not dissimilar to taking a blood sugar sampling. If anybody has, seen anyone taking one with diabetes, a prick of the finger, it's really simple and easy to do. It's a few drops of blood on a card. Anybody can do it. The instructions are very straightforward. There's not a lot of equipment needed or anything. Everything comes in a really small little clamshell packet that we send out with our tests, and it's very, very user friendly. I mean, they can be ordered online at our website or through a practitioner.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that are scared to get blood draws, or they just don't like the thought of being, drawn for blood. My dad used to pass out every time he would get his blood drawn, so this would be perfect for those type of individuals. Now, you measured the uniqueness too, because this is something where it really truly looks at if someone is eating fish or consuming supplements. Since you're measuring it over a longer period of time, you're going to really know that if that person is consuming those types of foods, correct?
Sure, yeah. So, the things that we look at when we're talking about any kind of nutritional biomarker are kind of the period of time that it's telling us about. If it's something that's a simple snapshot, that can be useful in some cases. But again, with something like omega-3 intakes, we need a larger picture. The most kind of high value nutritional biomarkers are ones that are both responsive to diet, but are not responsive to kind of day of changes, right? So again, I go back to the blood sugar marker. A fasting blood sugar has its purpose, or just taking a plasma blood sugar has its purpose, especially if you're, changing your diet, things like that, or if you have diabetes. But it's so easily affected by so many immediate factors, which that's why the hemoglobin A1C is very useful for monitoring kind of how someone's diet is doing overall, how they're doing overall on their blood sugar management. And the same thing is true with the omega-3 index. It's responsive to changes in diet, which is really important for a nutritional biomarker, because if it's not responsive to a change in diet, then, it's not really useful to kind of make any adjustments in your diet. But it gives us that larger picture because it is red blood cell based, and the red blood cells have a lifespan of about 90 days. It gives us that larger picture to say, okay, so over this 3-month span, your, intakes were where they need to be, or too low, or maybe we can back them off a little bit. But that's, having that longer time period is really, really useful.
Excellent. I realized what my next question, I should have had one question before, because the question I have, what's the typical blood level of omega-3 for the average American? But where do we want to get? What's an optimal range before we answer that question?
Sure, yeah. So for our omega-3 index, the results are expressed in percentages. So when we think about what the omega-3 index, it's the percent of the fatty acids, the phospholipids on a red blood cell, getting very technical, that are combined of EPA and DHA. So we find how much EPA and DHA are in a red blood cell membrane, and then the results are expressed as a percentage. So if a simple example, there's thousands and thousands of phospholipids in a red blood cell membrane, but a simplistic example is if we had 10 phospholipids and one was EPA and one was DHA, your omega-3 index would be 20%, because that's a very simplistic example. But our ideal levels for us are between 8 and 12%. So we want to see a minimum of 8%. That's kind of our goal that we want to get most people to. And then 12% is kind of our higher end of our optimal range. And then to answer your other question of kind of where do most Americans stand, it really depends on kind of who you are. And there's a great amount of variance between people, but sort of Americans on average are somewhere in the 5-ish% range. Again, that varies pretty significantly based on where you live, your socioeconomic status, other cultural factors. But in the US, we see probably about an average of about 5%. And then there are other subpopulations that we see lower levels. Athletes, people in the military, we often see closer to 4%. But yeah, I would say average for the US is about 5%.
And did I see somewhere where like a deficiency is considered less than 4%?
Yeah, so that would be what we would consider like a clinical deficiency is below 4%. And then kind of suboptimal is that 4 to 8% range. So ideally would get everybody up to 8%, but we do see big benefits if you are below 4%. You really need to be above that 4%
Okay.
at minimum. That's
Why do you
pretty
think?
rare.
Yeah, no, and what about like vegans? I mean, since there's not
Yeah,
a lot, I mean, is that a common deficiency for like vegan
absolutely.
vegetarians?
Yep, absolutely. That's a population I forgot to mention, but vegans are definitely in that, tend to be on that lower 4%. Some of them, that's a population where you may see trending towards that deficiency of below 4%, simply because EPA and DHA are only found in marine life. They are only found in fatty fish. There is some in algae, like algae-based supplements. And if you're eating a lot of nori, like seaweed, then you can get some as well. But in terms of dosage, that's pretty low, and you have to be eating it quite a lot. So in the US, we don't have seafood intake tends to be pretty low, especially if you don't live near a coast. And then if you add in the additional factor of being a vegan, you're definitely most likely not getting that unless you are supplementing for sure.
So with a good percentage, I think I read somewhere like 80, 90% of people have low levels. Why or why do so many Americans suffer from just either being deficient or being suboptimal? Is this lack of intake, lack of supplement use? What are some of
It's
those
it's really it's as I mentioned, we especially depending on geographical differences, we just don't intake a lot of fish in the US. It's expensive, especially if you don't live near a coast and fish has to be shipped. It's harder to come by. Getting fresh fish is difficult, and it's really, really expensive. And so we just don't eat enough fish. That is really the kind of primary cause for why so many Americans have low omega-3 index levels. If we look at other cultures, one of the areas that was kind of originally studied for this test was Japan, and they unsurprisingly have very, very high levels of omega-3s. Their omega-3 indexes on average are somewhere in the like 9% range, 9 to 10%, depending on kind of different areas. But they eat fish daily from a young age, through from childhood all through adulthood. So they just intake, and it makes sense. Again, island nation, they're going to be getting a lot more fish, and we just don't. It's a similar pattern in places like Europe and even Australia. We see similar, slightly better in those areas, depending again, if you're closer to like the Mediterranean, you might see slightly higher levels, but different types of fish with different levels of omega-3 are not necessarily found there as much. And so it's similar to in Europe and Australia that we're just not eating enough of these high omega-3 fish. And then, supplementation is a way to get there, but most people, aren't supplementing. So we just that the underlying reason is it's just we're not eating enough fish.
Yeah, here in Louisiana, it's not the right type of fish. We love shrimp. We love fried
Right.
shrimp. It's crawfish season. So if those things were loaded with omega-3s, we'd probably have a much healthier population.
Sure, yeah. So like I said, geographically, I mean, there are definitely areas where you're going to see if you live near the coast, you may be eating a ton of seafood, but it just may not be the fish that is high in those omega-3. So I live in North Carolina. On the Carolina coast, you get all sorts of fish, all sorts of seafood, but not a lot of it is super high in omega-3. So it's good for you for other reasons and delicious. So I definitely, I'm careful to tell people like, don't stop eating those types of fish. They're great. They have tons of other benefits, really high quality protein and other nutrients, but they just aren't high in omega-3. So it's not a substitution.
Let's talk about those scores and what they mean now. So what are some of the risks of being deficient or having levels low, let's say below 4%, 5%? Does this increase your risk for any specific conditions?
So with true deficiency, you can see all sorts of issues, acute issues like skin issues, issues with your eyes, just because that's where we utilize omega-3 as kind of an immediate term. And those types of things can show up with true deficiencies. When we're talking longer term, what types of issues we see with either deficiency or just suboptimal levels, those levels below 8%. And really, we see an increased risk a lot below 6%. Increased rates, the biggest one is cardiovascular disease risk. Risk for sudden cardiac death is kind of what it's most of the research is around in the omega-3 index, and really where the omega-3 index kind of was I guess discovered was and looking at this risk for sudden cardiac death, so strokes, heart attacks, and what was found is that the risk of those events goes up pretty significantly when the lower that your omega-3 index levels are. So we see that primarily in cardiovascular disease, but we're seeing all sorts of research now in other areas. Brain health is a pretty big area where we're seeing a lot of risks in having low omega-3 levels, increased risk potentially of dementia. Eye issues, as I mentioned, you can have increased dry eye with low levels of omega-3s, and there are some studies coming out that may be related to other issues like macular degeneration. Those are kind of the big bucket areas that we see with omega-3s, but the primary area that we the research is found in is that cardiovascular disease risk. And cardiovascular disease is obviously the number one killer of all Americans. So it's a pretty big bucket of things to worry about.
Now let's talk benefits, right? Let's say we optimize our range at 8 to 12% and how it improves different outcomes. I'm going to mention a few different diseases, and can you discuss, I guess, just any facet of the research on what does that do when you get to 8 to 12%?
Sure.
You mentioned cardiovascular disease first, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, so we see a pretty significant drop in likelihood of sudden cardiovascular disease or sudden cardiac events at that 8% level. So that's really where the origination of the 8 to 12% range came from, was just this pretty sudden drop in incidence of sudden cardiac death. So those heart attacks and strokes kind of coming out of nowhere, those events drop pretty precipitously at that 8 to 12 at that 8% level. And so that's where researchers, Dr. Harris being one of them, kind of set that 8% limit was improvements. But we see reductions in other facets of cardiovascular disease, hardening of arteries, things like that, artery calcification with that 8% as well.
You mentioned brain health, so let's talk about that. What are some of the outcomes from having higher levels?
Brain health is so interesting. So there's kind of two facets here that are things we want to care about. The one side is child development and brain development outcomes, and then the other side is adult later life dementia sort of outcomes. So it's creating a foundation for brain health, and then also kind of preserving that function and foundation later on in life. So if I start with the childhood outcomes, our brain, one of the, quite literally the building block of our brain, our neurons, is DHA. DHA is an incredibly important building block for our neuronal function. And so babies in utero need pretty high amounts of DHA in order to form their brain and their eyes. And so when we see inadequate levels of DHA, we can see brain and eye development be affected slightly. And especially when we get to really inadequate levels of DHA, we can see, some slight cognitive outcomes being reduced. There's some research looking at incidence of things like ADHD, autism, if those could be potentially related, although again, the outcomes are not, those aren't clear, but we do know that DHA is very, very highly necessary for brain and eye development. And then I would throw in that, category as well too, preterm birth, a little bit of a tangent, but having adequate levels of DHA during pregnancy reduces the risk of preterm birth. There is a very, very, very solid body of evidence that shows that having adequate amounts of DHA in your diet prior to pregnancy and during pregnancy reduces rates of preterm birth. So between preterm birth rates, eye and brain health development on that side. DHA specifically, but omega-3s generally are really, really important to brain health development there. When we switch over to talking about later on in life and preserving kind of brain function, optimizing brain function, there's a few buckets there. We see dementia. There's a fair amount of research coming out now showing that dementia rates seem to be lower, and the progression of dementia seems to be a bit slower in people who have that minimum of 8% on their omega-3 index, which is kind of amazing. Dementia, Alzheimer's is a growing phenomenon right now. It's a growing condition. A lot diagnoses are increasing pretty significantly, and part of that is because people are living longer, and so how can we live longer but reduce our incidence and make our quality of life better? And omega-3s seem to at least be correlated with lower dementia rates, and a lot of this ties back to inflammation, which I can talk about in a few minutes, but yeah, dementia, we're seeing that there. And then another area that's really, really interesting in terms of omega-3s is brain injury. And so this is where I came to omega-3s from, was from working with the military. But traumatic brain injury, whether it be concussive brain injury or other types of brain injury, omega-3s, there is a very large body of evidence showing that omega-3s can be really, really helpful in kind of mitigating some of the damage of omega-3s and helping, or of brain injury, and helping heal from that brain injury as well. So kind of that was a lot all at once, but there is a lot of evidence that omega-3s are really important for our brain function. And so from birth and before birth and throughout our lifespan, having adequate omega-3 levels, somewhere around that 8%, can help mitigate our risk for dementia and possibly, mitigate some of the risks if we ever to incur a brain injury as well.
Awesome. No, that was great. Lots of incredible information on CVD for cardiovascular disease, brain health. What about metabolic health, diabetes?
Yeah, so a lot of the research there, again, there seems to be some really, really good correlation. It's a tough one to tell kind of where the effect is coming from, but there does seem to be some evidence that those higher levels of omega-3s are benefiting metabolic health, especially with prevention of type 2 diabetes. And we think it probably, again, with all of these, if you were to ask me what the mechanism with pretty much everything is probably has to do with inflammation moderation. Omega-3s are responsible for kind of moderating the other side of the inflammatory reaction and these inflammatory cascades. And all of these diseases, from cardiovascular disease to dementia, Alzheimer's, and type 2 diabetes, are all what we would call like inflammatory diseases. These are diseases where we see lots of inflammation in the body. And so it makes cognitive sense that omega-3s, which can help mitigate inflammation and moderate those cascades, would help. Having adequate omega-3 levels would help kind of reduce the risk of some of these things. And again, with metabolic diseases such as type 2 diabetes, we do see if you have those omega-3s in that 8 to 12%, you have a little bit lower risk of having type 2 diabetes, and may possibly have a little bit easier time with blood sugar control generally.
Awesome. I'm glad you said inflammation, because that was my next one. So we don't have to cover that, because that's something everyone says, I'm inflamed. I'm inflamed.
Yeah.
So yes, you should be on omega-3. Now, last one is really not. Is any other outcomes you'd like to share that I didn't ask?
If I had to drive one home, it would be the preterm birth rates. I think it's one that we don't see a lot covered in I think kind of popular media. I think most people have kind of become more familiar with the cardiovascular disease, just simply because there's so much information and so much research out there on that. But I think with preterm birth, I couldn't stress enough how important that omega-3 seem to play a role. And so when it comes to pregnancy, we really, really encourage anybody who could become pregnant, like, to get your omega-3 levels up before pregnancy. It's good for you. It's good for your baby. It's good for you long term. It's good for them long term, and potentially can reduce that risk of preterm birth. That's probably the one that I would, shout from the rooftops the most. But the area where I came from and kind of came to omega-3s and this space was brain injury. And so, especially in the world of sport, omega-3s seem to be at least potentially a little bit protective when it comes to concussion and subconcussive injuries, and can be helpful in recovery after a brain injury as well too. So those are kind of two areas where like I have a personal passion, and I think just not enough people are aware of those benefits.
Excellent. We've talked about too low. We've talked about the right range. Let's talk about too high. If someone's levels were like really high, 15, 20%, is there any harm? Do we have any research in those types of groups? And tell us a
So
little bit more about
we don't have any evidence that says that being too high is a risk. And the real question comes down to what are you doing to get that high, to be that high? And do you want to continue doing it? Again, we don't have any evidence thus far that shows that being high over that 12% poses a risk, even up into those teens. And I think the highest I've ever seen was like 22. We don't have any evidence that shows that poses any health risk in the long term. The question is for most folks is going to be, what are you doing to get there? Are you taking super doses of fish oil and eating fish and doing all these things? Well, maybe we could potentially save you some pills you don't have to take, and maybe potentially we don't you could save you a little bit of money by not needing to take that stuff. Really, with those high levels, there's no known risk, but there's also no additional benefit. The upper level of 12% was sort of set because that's where we see a kind of plateauing in the benefits, especially on the cardiovascular disease front. But we see it elsewhere as well too. So to be over that, it's not harmful that we know of, but you're not getting any additional benefit. So it's not a more is always better type situation. So I always just, if I'm talking to somebody and they're asking that question for themselves, I say it's really up to you. If you're taking a lot of a supplement and it's costing you a lot of money and you could still be around 12% if we cut your dose down, then maybe that's something you want to consider, but it's really a personal choice. There are also some individuals that just genetically have higher levels. We don't exactly understand why, but there does seem to be a kind of a genetic predisposition to having high levels. So I've seen some people who aren't taking supplements and eat kind of an average amount of fatty fish that have really high levels. And that's usually what we have attributed that to. But as far as being high, there's no known risk, just really no additional benefit either.
excellent. Let's talk about how to optimize. We mentioned and we talked about earlier, so many people, 80, 90% are low or suboptimal. Let's kind of figure out how do we get them from like 4% to 8%. The first question is really, a lot of people like supplements, right? So that's the easy thing is I don't eat a lot of salmon or certain types of fish that are high in omega-3. I won't touch sardines. So I'm a supplement person, but there's a lot of omega-3 fish oil on the market that come in different forms. Can we talk about those forms and what they are and why they're useful?
Absolutely. There are a lot of options. And so it's good and it's bad. It's good in the sense that, you have a lot of choices and you can find something that works really well for you if you need a little bit or you need a higher dose. So I'll start kind of at the very, top level of what we're looking at when we're looking at supplements. The most important factor when it comes to a supplement is the dose. The most important thing is the dose. So usually for most people, if we go with the example of the average American who's around that 5%, they're probably going to need somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of omega-3s. And if we use, again, that's an example, everyone's a little bit different, but if we look at a lot of fish oil supplements on the market, they're pretty low dose. So the first thing you want to do is take a look at the label, and we're looking for the combined dose of EPA and DHA. Oftentimes we'll see with supplements, it'll say 1,000 milligrams of fish oil on the front. And then when you turn it over and take a look at the supplement facts label, you're going to see, that it's got 200 milligrams of EPA and 100 milligrams of DHAs for a total dose of 300 milligrams of omega-3s. That other 700 milligrams, the difference between that 1,000 and that 300, it's filler oil. It's just a poor quality supplement. You're not getting something that's been refined very well. And so the most important thing to look for is dose. So if you're kind of on the market for looking for a supplement, you want something that is going to have an adequate dose and that you're not going to have to take 10 of in order to get your necessary dose. We do have research that correlates intakes to the omega-3 index. And for OmegaQuant, there's a calculator on our website that you can use to calculate what your omega-3 index is and how much you need based off of your levels. That's the whole point of testing, right? So I get a lot of people ask, how much do I need? And the answer is, it very much depends based on your levels and what you're already taking. So the first thing we'll look at is dose. You want to make sure that your supplement is getting you the adequate dose and that you're not having to take 10 pills a day. There are plenty of supplements on the market that you can that will get you there. The second thing we look at is form. So there are several different types, and there's kind of two ways you can look at form. So there's things like krill oil, fish oil, algae oil that are similar. They're a little bit different, but in the end of the day, the thing we care most about is that dose. So if people often ask, what's the difference between, is krill oil better or is fish oil better? And the answer is it really doesn't matter. When it comes down to it, we want that total dose of omega-3. So if you find you like a krill oil that you like, and that works for you, and you find it at a dose and a price that works for you, that's great. Same with the fish oil. I will say with algae oils, those are going to be the kind of only option for our vegan folks. And so those tend on average to have a little bit lower of a dose. So you may have to double up on those depending, or take additional servings in order to meet your dose. So dose, form, and then the next one is, in terms of form, is triglyceride versus an ethyl ester form. And then we're starting to see some new phospholipid supplements coming on the market. This just refers to kind of the chemical form of the omega-3s. The two we have the most research on are the ethyl ester and triglyceride form. Ethyl esters they're man-made essentially, and they are a little bit less well absorbed than triglyceride form fish oil. Triglyceride form is exactly the same as what is found in food, and so just digestively we're able to absorb that just a little bit better than we do the ethyl ester form. So a lot of prescription fish oil is ethyl ester form. Again, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means you may not absorb it as well as the triglyceride form. So for most people, I highly recommend a triglyceride form fish oil and then the adequate dose. Those are probably the biggest factors.
Yeah, and I guess it should say it on the bottle. I know in all the bottles they probably won't say ethyl ester because of that. It's more processed. But I noticed most brands that use triglyceride form, they even say on their bottle somewhere, in triglyceride form.
Yeah, most brands that take the effort to make a triglyceride form fish oil, they want to tell you about it, and so it's going to be pretty easy to find that out. And so for the most part, you can find that out. If it doesn't say anything, I would most likely automatically assume it's an ethyl ester, unless otherwise. If it's not on their website or anything like that, that would be the safe assumption I would make. It may be a wrong assumption, but it's most likely if they're not telling you that it's a triglyceride, then it's most likely an ethyl ester.
Now, you mentioned dose is so important, right? So how long would it take for someone to go from, let's say, 4% to 8% at 1,500, or is there a certain dose that they should start with? And then how long should they wait before they retest to see if they went to 8%?
Sure, yeah. So because of the life cycle of the red blood cell, we want to wait about 3 months at least in between tests. And it is very possible to go from 4 or 5% to 8% in that 3 months. The most important things there are consistency, taking your supplement every single day, taking that supplement with food as well too is really, really important, especially fat, making sure that you're taking it with a meal or a snack that has some amount of fat in it. You probably just don't want to eat it with crackers, right? If you're going to have even something like a bowl of cereal is fine because if it's fat, as long as your milk has fat in it. So if you were eating cereal in the morning and you have whole milk, that's perfectly fine. It's got some fat, that'll do.
You can
But
drop your fish oil capsules in the cereal and you won't even know.
that's an option. I'm not sure it's one I would take, but it's a choice. I had someone to ask me if they could put their liquid fish oil in their oatmeal, and I was like, "Listen, man,
Oh,
go for it," but I don't know. I was like, that is up to you. Personal preference, and I won't begrudge you that. But yeah, so making sure you're taking it with food, making sure you're taking it consistently, and you should be able to get there, get from that 4 or 5% in 3 months, at least 3 months, 3 to 4, typically because of the red blood cell life cycle to see that increase. The other most important thing is don't stop taking it once you get to that desired level. Oftentimes people think I'm going to get to the desired level and then I'm going to stop. Or they become really inconsistent with it. For the vast majority of people, whatever dose you needed to get to 8% is the dose you need to stay on for maintenance. There really is no lowered maintenance dose for most people. I would say the exception to that would be people who are doing like super high doses post like concussion or something like that, but that's a different animal. For anyone who's just trying to raise their levels via supplementation, start with one test. Once you get those results, adjust your dose accordingly, and then wait 3 months and retest again. And then if you're at 8%, you keep with that dose. If you're not, if you haven't quite gotten there because maybe your supplement wasn't high enough, dose wasn't high enough, you weren't consistent, or other host of reasons, then you want to repeat the process again. Increase the dose or change whatever, make whatever changes you need to, and then wait another 3 months and test.
So I want to stay on this topic. I want to skip this one question, come back to it, and go to the last question in this section. If someone's levels are optimal, like they supplement, they get to 8, let's say they get to 10% and go, I'm good, and they stop for 3 months, can their levels drop?
Absolutely. Yep. They may take it depending on how high their levels were, and depending how much they've got circulating, they may take a little while to drop low. But absolutely, if you go from taking a ton to taking none, in the span of 3 months, your levels will drop. Will they drop all the way to 3 or 4%? Probably not. But you definitely will see a drop, and it's individual, and it very much depends on how quickly they will drop. But absolutely. I've seen people who are like, yep, I just didn't take my supplement for 6 months and they're back to where they started. And it's very frustrating. But the main point is just whatever dose you need to get to that 8% is probably going to be your maintenance dose from then on.
Got it. And let's say there's a lot of people out there that just don't like taking supplements, they don't believe in them. Maybe it's too hard to swallow pills. What about fish? What are some of the best sources of fish that someone can consume that's high in omega-3?
Sure, yeah. So the acronym I tell people to remember is SMASH, and that's salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring. Those are the highest omega-3 fish, and they also tend to be the kind of safest lower levels of mercury contamination, because that is a concern for some folks. Tuna is up there as well too, but again, because they're larger fish, we might be a little bit concerned with mercury contamination. That primarily is a concern for pregnant women, but for most people, it's perfectly fine to eat a small amount of tuna, a can or two of tuna, a couple times a week. That's perfectly fine. But the acronym we use is SMASH. Those are your big ones that are going to be the highest in omega-3s.
And if someone's consuming enough to where they're getting the same dosage in supplements and they're eating out 3-4 times a week, they can still optimize their levels.
Yes. Yep. Fish will do it. And actually, fish, what's interesting too is that there are some, small known risks for, omega-3 supplements. There's a little bit of research showing a potential risk for some high risk patients with things like, atrial fibrillation. It's really the only one that we know of, that is a small risk for, with omega-3 supplements. And there is no such risk with eating fish. So if you are concerned about supplement safety or you have health conditions that you're worried about potentially taking high doses of omega-3s, although omega-3s out of all the supplements are incredibly, incredibly safe, even at fairly high doses, then fish is the least risky. There's no known risks, and it will get you to that level just the same as supplements.
Awesome. Just a few more questions. Anything else that you'd like to include or discuss around the benefits of omega-3 testing, optimizing levels? Anything we didn't discuss today?
No, I think probably the biggest thing is, kind of one of our mottos at OmegaQuant is like, if you can't measure it, if you don't measure it, you can't monitor it, and you can't manage it. And so with a lot of things in nutrition, we have to do a lot of trial and error, right? Nutrition is a little bit of trying things, seeing what works, what doesn't. And there's a reason why there's a really big push kind of towards more biomarkers and more individualization. It's so we can know the first time, without having to kind of stab in the dark a lot. So I would say if anybody is kind of questioning, do I need this, or who's appropriate to be tested, especially if you have healthcare practitioners out there, who's appropriate, I say everybody. You don't need to test every 3 months for life. For the most part, what we recommend people do is, get a test, get your levels adjusted, get it confirmed by another test that you've got, adequate amounts, and then you should be good for a while. If you want to test once a year, you could, just to kind of know that. But once you get to a level where you are, your intakes are meeting those needs, it's everybody can benefit from it. It's not just populations who are at risk for those diseases, although, those populations benefit quite a bit. It's not just older people. It's not just pregnant women. It's everybody can benefit. And unless you're eating a ton of fatty fish all the time and you're pretty positive of that, I recommend everybody get at least one.
Where can someone go get an OmegaQuant test kit? Can they just get this online?
Yep. So you can go to our website, OmegaQuant.com, and you can order direct from us. We also do work with quite a few healthcare practitioners around the country. So if you happen to find a healthcare practitioner who you can order their test through our test through them as well. And they can do, results interpretation with you. It's always nice to have, somebody answer those questions. But yeah, you can go straight to our website and order a test. We will ship it off to you. Once you get it, you do it in your house, you get your card, your blood spot, pack it back up and send it off to our lab, and you get results. Usually by the time we receive it, it's within about 5 days. You should get your results back.
Awesome. Kelly, this was fantastic. Now, you're not done. Something you didn't realize is we have what's called a curveball round, and it's where I'm going to ask you questions that have nothing to do with today's topic. They're fun. You might not know the answers, but it's just kind of fun. So you up for just a couple of questions?
Sure.
All right. First question is always, I ask everyone about music because if I could go back and do anything, it would be being a performer. If you could be the lead singer of any band, group, or anything, previous or today, who would that be?
Oh my gosh. Man, I don't know if I'd be a great lead singer at all because I can't sing, but one of my favorite bands is the Foo Fighters, and so I would just love to hang out with them.
I saw them at Jazz Fest just last Friday. So,
oh yeah.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Always a great show. Great answer. If you could, as a dietitian, if you can only have one food the rest of your life, what would that be?
Oh my gosh.
It could be a casserole or a meal too.
Okay. Man, the immediate answer that comes to mind is cereal. I love cereal. If I could have a variety of cereal, I'd probably be good for the rest of my life.
Okay. And then if you weren't not a dietitian, you can go back and do any other profession, what would that profession be?
Oh man. to become like an interior designer or something.
Okay.
Something way different.
So Foo Fighters, listening to Foo Fighters, eating cereal and designing the interior of a home.
That would
There
be
we
me.
go. Kelly, this is fantastic. Incredible, valuable information. Everyone, please go to www.omegaquant.com, get your tests, see where your levels are, and then retest in 3 months, implement a protocol, whether that's through fish oil, whether that's through food, and just see, because there's a ton of value in improving your quality of life. Thank you, Kelly, for your time and expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.